Welcome to the High Achievers podcast, where we host extraordinary individuals who are disrupting and transforming the way we do business and the way we lead ourselves and others. Now, our today's guest is a sustainability and a circular economy expert. She's a systems thinker, a champion of diversity, and a true change agent. She's also a co-founder of the Moonshot City, which first started as a podcast and a blog and is exploring big questions around what makes a city resilient and regenerative. Now, please help me welcome this extraordinary woman, Juhi Shareef. Juhi, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Juhi, tell us, when we first met, I know your mission was and is very clear. That is creating a circular economy for cities to thrive in a very sustainable, zero waste way. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you obsessed with this topic?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a sustainability practitioner for about over 15 years, I think. And, the reason that I and my business partner are really interested in cities is because they're really great scale to enact change. But actually, so kind of when I got interested in sustainability to start off with, I thought, well, look, we need to do less bad. We need to reduce our waste, go for zero waste. We need to reduce our carbon footprints, go for net zero carbon, and it was all about kind of like reduce, and actually aiming for zero is really uninspiring, right, to me, and I think to many people. And so what I recognize is that even if as human beings we get to that like net zero, we still might be using the resources of 1.5 planets. So what do we do? Because we really need to have a radical system shift in a very short period of time if we're all going to thrive as a society, right? So then I started learning about regenerative economics rather than sustainable development. And for me, that's kind of like, so where if you imagine that kind of currently we're in like a conventional development state, a very extractive model where you're taking stuff out of the earth, you're making stuff, and then you're just sticking it back in landfill, also called linear economics. When you get to zero, what you then want to do is really to start putting restorative practices in place. So how do you restore the ecosystems? How do you create a situation in which societies thrive? And a really good model for this is something called donut economics, actually, which I think describes it really well. And I think we'll talk more about later. So to your point is that, although when we met, I was really, excited by circular economy, and for the last couple of years have been chairing something in New Zealand called the Circular Economy Accelerator Advisory Board. And but I've actually kind of now started thinking, this is we all need to move to a more restorative, regenerative model. So that's kind of what really gets me out of bed these days. So yeah.
Okay, well, I was listening to your podcast that you co-host with your business partner, Priti, and it's called the Moonshot City. And you've hosted a guest, Debbie O'Byrne, and one of the things that she had said really intrigued me. She said that the climate change and the waste problem is not so much an environmental issue as much as it is a business and a human behavior problem. And I really liked that point. So basically the question that I have for you is, what are some challenges that you are facing while trying to achieve this change in the way the businesses and the economies operate globally?
Yeah. Well, Debbie is fantastic. She's currently the circular economy lead in at Lake Macquarie Council, which is a council in Australia, and we've had some many fantastic conversations about this. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that the entire system, our entire economy, has to change kind of in parallel. And I think that a critical skill that business leaders need to have now to navigate this is systems thinking. So there's been a lot of talk about agility and, you know, in recent years, and kind of an agile mindset. And yes, that's absolutely important. But what people don't talk so much about is the context in which these problems exist. Because you know, the challenges for me here in Auckland, looking at from a city perspective, versus the you know, the challenges of someone, you know, in cities in India or the UK or, you know, States, wherever, maybe very, very different. So there's, you know, lots of factors in common, but I think the most important thing is to first understand your environmental and social context. Your in the kind of indigenous people in New Zealand, the Maori people, talk about your whakapapa, and this is like your ancestry, and for them their ancestry is inextricably linked to nature. So once you understand your local context and your environment, the histories and the kind of stories around it, you can then, I think, come up with solutions that you may not have thought of otherwise, right? So it's not just kind of like listening to a bunch of fairy tales and, you know, stuff, but it's genuinely talking to people who for here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who are the original settlers, who understand this country, you know, much better than the Pākehā, the Western settlers do, through their oral history. And there's a lot to learn from that. So back to your question, I think that one of the biggest challenges is that yes, there is so much to do. Where do you start, and how do you shift the whole system in a way that is appropriate to your local context?
Well, and as you were saying, there's a lot of puzzles that have to come together for this to work, right? So one thing is for us to talk about the sustainable or circular economy or regenerative cities in theory, but then there's a whole other aspect when you're trying to put all that into practice. So if you looked at a city who would only wish to start with circular economy, where would they start first, I guess?
Well, a really good place to start is energy. So I think that the energy system in a city is, you know, it's almost, if you think about a city as a living system, you know, it is the pulse of a city. And you know, the big story in town for anyone who's got half a brain is climate change, right? This is you know, that we've got many challenges, but I think climate change is the biggest, because if we, you know, don't react in time, and some people say that the scientists are basically saying that we need to act within the next 9 years to stay within warming of 1.5 degrees, which is just, it's not long. But if we leave it too long, then we'll just reach a tipping point where there are these horrific feedback loops, which just accelerate warming, which could be potentially catastrophic. It's not going to be this gradual kind of like warming of the planet. We could see some really awful consequences. And so, given that, and the relationship between energy use and, you know, generally globally from fossil fuels, and climate change, you know, that's a really important place to start. New Zealand is very lucky in that about 80% of our energy mix is from renewables, a lot from hydro, and so on. And so we're starting from a better position, but we still per capita, I think, use, you know, some of the most energy across the planet, you know, so it's still quite an energy intensive from a consumption perspective. But yes, I think that's absolutely a really key place to start, because you know, if you are in a country where you're relying on coal quite heavily, then it's really important to decarbonize as rapidly as possible.
Right. And so if we now look at the global picture, right? New Zealand, as you said, is starting in a very good position. What are some examples throughout the globe that we could learn from? Or perhaps maybe if you could share with us an example or two around the world that of cities who are actually applying a few concepts of regenerative cities that we could all learn from and act on.
Yeah, look, there are lots of organizations who are doing some fantastic stuff. And the C40 is, I mean, it was originally like the 40 largest cities. I'm not sure they were including China at the time, but it was set up by mayors in cities across the world, I think originally in London and Paris. But so it's a kind of global network of cities connected at mayoral level who are all working together to try and share knowledge, share information, share best practice, and also kind of commit to improving. So one of the areas they're very focused on is waste, for example, as well as energy. But there's other initiatives like the Thriving Cities Initiative, which is made up of, so C40 is a member of that, but also they also partner with a company called Circle Economy, and they are really looking to really try to share the model of donut economics around the world. So some of your viewers or listeners might be familiar with donut economics. It's a new economic model that has been designed by a fantastic economist called Kate Raworth, unsurprisingly a woman, I have to say. That it's that I say, you know, it's really wonderful because it actually for the first time shows that there are limits to growth. Right. And so it's proposing, if you imagine a donut with a hole in the middle, for those of you who haven't heard of this, the inner circle is kind of our social foundation. And you can map that to the social sustainable development goals. So there's 17 sustainable development goals developed by the UN. And so the social ones kind of map to the inner circle. The outer circle is the ecological ceiling. So there's 9 planetary boundaries. And what Kate says is that we need to exist, the safe and just space for humanity and for cities, therefore, is in the middle of those. So there's now a lot of data around kind of what those ecological boundaries are and the social issues are. So you can actually put metrics to this, and cities are starting to use this model of donut economics to help inform policy. So for example, Amsterdam was, I think, the first city to do a donut economics action lab, and now I think it's spread to cities across the world. So there's a couple in the States, and closer to where I am now, Melbourne and so on. But the Thriving Cities initiative that I mentioned is helping to scale this approach for cities and partnering with city councils to do that. So there's some fantastic examples. But look, there's many examples of cities around the world doing fantastic things, and there's a map in fact on our website that you can have a look at some of the global examples around the world.
So is this a part of what you do with the Moonshot City project? Because I understand that this started as a podcast and a blog initially, but now it's going into a completely full-blown project in New Zealand and around. So please talk to us more about.
I should say that my partner Preeti Ambani and I we have day jobs, right? So this is something that we're doing for love, and just to try and to create that system shift that I was talking about earlier. So it started off as an exploration of the big questions around what really makes a resilient and regenerative city. And I think resilience is a key part of this because here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we get a lot of earthquakes and, there's volcanoes, and it's kind of very interesting from a geological perspective. But also at this time where we have come out of lockdown, what some people are calling quarantine, our second lockdown, and are now kind of like going back to quote unquote normal, there's a lot of kind of discussion about personal resilience right through this whole period, which I think is kind of really important to say. So we kind of explore these big topics with some leading thinkers. through a city's lens. And one of the initiatives that we'd done actually before we'd launched this podcast, I had taken this donut economic model and kind of was really thinking about why circular economy hadn't taken off in New Zealand as it had done in other countries around the world. Like in Europe, it's massive. America's kind of getting on the case. India, there's many, there are countries that are really starting to look at kind of circular economy as a solution. And what I realized was that it didn't have the local context. So for me, the donut was a fantastic way to actually tell the story of our, here are the ecological boundaries, here is the social foundation, and circular economy should exist in between those two. Because if we're not careful, it can be yet another model that ends up benefiting the wealthy or kind of big business, that you, for example, have a pair of trainers or products that, you extract the materials, you make the product, you design it to be modular, you use leasing models, you do all these fantastic things so that you create new income streams where you're not extracting more raw materials, and you keep those products materials in use for as long as possible, right? Before ultimately, recycling them or, putting them in an organic waste stream. But that doesn't address the issue of, if you are someone who doesn't have a high income, maybe you can't afford that, right? So it doesn't address some of the wider social issues. So we took the donut, and I worked with a Maori scientist, fantastic woman called Tena Boasadine, who's a Tūhoi Maori woman, and she I said to her, please, would you translate this into Te Reo Māori? Because one of the biggest challenges that we've got here in New Zealand is a real kind of inequality between the Pākehā, the Westerners, and the Indigenous Māori. This is not unusual in countries around the world, right? Look at Australia, look at the States. This is but there is a Treaty of Waitangi which the government, the Crown has really made efforts to acknowledge. And so there is a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of racism here. There's still a lot of social inequality. So for me, when I'm looking at things like systems change and new economic models, we need to reset the inequalities that are built into our current linear economic system, right? The institutionalized racism, the poverty, all of those things, we need to address those. So I think it's very important that, therefore, in the work that we do, that the Māori people are at the table and are leading discussions and are leading with their values and principles, and for us to listen and to make space for them, to lead. And so Tena did this fantastic piece of work where she translated the donut into Te Reo Māori. And I was like, well, that's great, But then she went a step further, and she flipped the inner social circle with the outside ecological ceiling and brought the environment into the middle and said, from a Māori worldview, this is, the environment is our ancestry, is our foundation. And the social stuff can sit on the outside. And I initially was like, oh, but we can't compare this with Cape Raworth donut. What do we, how are we going to, with my consultant's hat on, I was thinking, oh, this doesn't work. And then I realized that it was just not my worldview. It wasn't my worldview. It was the Māori worldview. And frankly, there is something so wonderful about the fact that, we can hold this model up and say, this is the Māori worldview, this is the Western worldview. We both want the same thing, but we're coming from two different directions, right? And in actual fact, what Tena said is that this is just, you guys are coming to Indigenous wisdom. We've known this all along. And we don't talk about donuts, we talk about spirals, what they call a takarangi, right? And this is well done, like finally, you're getting there, And so this piece of work, actually, when we published it through the Moonshot City site, went viral, and it was kind of amazing how much positive feedback we've had. And even on Kate Raworth's Donut Economics Lab, Action Lab platform, it was the most viewed story. We've had some just wonderful people from that, Indigenous people all over the world reaching out to us, which has been fantastic. And so, really that was the kind of the start of the journey. And now what we're doing is, we're working with Taina and some Maori wayfinders, but we're working. So they are working on creating values and principles, and we, the Moonshot City team, um, are working in parallel to then say, how do we now make it real? Instead of all of this talk, how do we map all of the regenerative projects across Australia and New Zealand to start off with? And then once we've done that, we're going to kind of really look at developing something like a donor economics action lab, but that's rooted in kind of indigenous values. So regenerative action labs. How do we kind of develop a framework for that so that any community can pick it up and do it themselves?
That's a huge step forward. How about the government's incentives? How do they fit into all of these beautiful plans that you have?
Well, first of all, we're lucky that we probably have, I'm just going to say it, probably the best political leader globally who's just been re-elected. So, whatever your, political views are, in my personal opinion, I think Jacinda Ardern is just a phenomenal leader. And I'm so grateful, like looking at the absolute mess that the UK is in because of their kind of current lack of leadership, shocking, and the States just, let's not even talk about it. But not just, there's increased polarization all around the world, right? So to have just had a national election where the Labour Party, which is a kind of left-wing party, got in with a resounding majority, has been fantastic, because what it means is that we are able to continue the work of rebuilding the social fabric that I think when there's been this cult of the individual, and I think it's something that has been a really kind of Western thing about, like, I must succeed at the expense of others. It's all about me, 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 more money, more success, more power, right? And actually, we're seeing the results of that, right? Globally, we're seeing the catastrophic, fires in California or in Australia. We're seeing, flooding all around the world. We're seeing that, ice caps melting at a ridiculous rate. Collapse in our ecosystems, and loss of biodiversity, and living through the sixth mass extinction, and all of this horrific stuff, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. So in terms of, like, to your point about what government can do, I think government has a challenge, particularly in a really short election cycle. So here in New Zealand, they've only got 3 years. I mean, like, that's kind of like, that's no time at all, right? When you're talking about creating long-term change, a lot of what they can do is kind of work in partnership, I think, is a really key thing. So what we are doing more and more in New Zealand is kind of like co-designing regulation, for example, because industry and business just moves much faster than government. Government's really reactive. Regulators are really reactive. Things need to move much faster. And so I think government can basically just needs to start removing barriers to this kind of systems change, and also needs to start thinking of itself and how it delivers services from a more systemic perspective. Because if you are after funding, for example, you have to go to like different pots of different departments, or there's different pots of funding around. And actually, if you're talking about trying to create a systemic change, you need those pots of funding to be aligned with the outcomes that you want. And so I don't know if that's going to happen in and how long it's going to take, and all of that stuff. So basically, we're not waiting for government. It's great if we've got a supportive government, but regardless of who would have been elected, we would have just still carried on, because business sees the absolute imperative in change, as do communities, across the world.
Absolutely.
So a really practical example of how governments are working with businesses here in New Zealand anyway is something called product stewardship. And product stewardship has got different names in different countries. So some people call it extended producer responsibility, but essentially it means being responsible for a product no matter where you are on that value chain. And at the end of its use or its life, kind of taking it back and then making sure it's properly recycled. And that's something that, so the government here in New Zealand has named 6 kind of priority product group areas, including the area that I'm kind of most focused on is e-waste, but I'm also working on a product stewardship scheme for textiles at end of life in an advisory capacity. So that's called used fully, that one. And so in the e-waste category, something that I have been doing is working with a collaboration of over 140 businesses and individuals on large batteries. So we've set something up called a battery industry group, big, and we've done a lot of work to kind of research this waste stream that's coming at us. And this is batteries from EVs and batteries for energy storage. And what we're doing is we're designing a product stewardship scheme that supports the circular economy, because large batteries, once they come out of an electric car, can have, you know, up to 80% capacity. So they can be reused on the electricity network or reused to power boats and all sorts of things. And there's some fantastic examples of businesses doing this in Europe and Japan. And so we're designing the scheme. A lot of the ecosystem of businesses that will need to deliver the scheme doesn't exist yet, but we've had the vision for it. So we've actually co-created a vision with industry, and now we're co-creating the scheme with government. So that's a really tangible example of how government and business can work together, and then the government will ensure that that scheme is regulated to make sure it's a fair playing field and that everyone has to be involved.
So Juhi, for example, if I'm a startup and I'm very passionate about the environment and I really want to help create and co-create this regenerative circular economy, what are some, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 things that I could include into my business model when starting to help you out?
I think what's really helpful is just to first of all, to understand the context that you're going to be operating in, right? So I talk a lot about context. So understand the, you know, where you're going to be based, and even if you're online, like where are your products being sourced from, where are you going to sell? What is the environmental and social context in which you're operating, and what is the environmental and social needs that you're fulfilling? Because it is not enough as a business to just make crap, like plastic crap, and just sell it for a profit. Like those days are over, like, you know, and those businesses will fail. And what we need is to make sure that, so a startup will understand its context and have a purpose, right? So a purpose aligned with you know, that social environmental piece is really important. And then once you've done that, then I think the 3 principles of a circular economy that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation you know, shares. So it's basically designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. I think those are 3 fantastic principles to keep in mind, because in terms of a business model, what you really want to be thinking about is you know, don't look to the past, but kind of like look to see what outcome you want, and then design your model accordingly. Because it may be that, you know, a leasing model or is much better than a traditional kind of retail. That if you are going to be selling a product or leasing a product, as I was saying, you do actually want to make sure that you're taking it back at the end of use. So you want to design it to be modular. So every step in that chain needs to be really considered, because you don't want it just to be a linear chain. You want it to be a loop where those valuable materials are coming back to you and keep on cycling. And so digital is going to play a huge role in that, you know, potentially, you know, technologies like blockchain to track products, etc. So there's all sorts of thinking around this. But essentially, if you keep those three principles in mind, um, and your context at the start, I think that you'll be in a really good shape.
That's very practical. Thank you very much for that. So Juhi, for anyone who's looking to get educated on this topic, are there any books, any podcasts, any shows, anything that you'd recommend for them to pick up?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, so, I wasn't the only one who started a podcast during lockdown or quarantine. I think there's been this absolute kind of explosion in people having these really important dialogues, right? So, there are many excellent podcasts, and what I'll do is I'll make some recommendations, and if you include them on your site, then that would be great. Obviously, everyone's welcome to come and check out the Project Moonshot City website. So that's projectmoonshot.city. And just acknowledging the fact, as I said, that we're, kind of now, we've been doing a bunch of podcasts and so on, but actually now we're focusing on actually mapping regenerative projects. So I'd be really interested if anyone wants to get in touch with examples of what they feel are regenerative projects. That's amazing. There's a book which I thought was fantastic. I don't know why this has come to mind really, but there's a book called Low Tech, LO-TEK, by Julia Watson, and that really, it's just a wonderful book. It talks about the indigenous indigenous examples of engineering, really. So she talks about there's one particular example that sticks in my head, which is the Kazi people in India make living bridges, and so they create bridges that are made from roots of trees, and they kind of twist them over and vines, and twist them over a ravine, say. But these bridges last for hundreds of years, despite landslides and flooding, etc. And so they're incredibly resilient. And it's a really good example of, it's not just biomimicry, it's actually using nature to solve a problem. So that's a wonderful book. Another fantastic book for anyone interested in this part of the world is it's kind of like a new atlas for Aotearoa New Zealand called We Are Here by Chris McDowell. And something that the kind of Moonshot City team is really looking at is data, and data around things like resource flows, the flows of energy and waste and materials across a particular location. And Chris and his partner Tim have written this beautifully illustrated book. So I really recommend that. And obviously, I will recommend Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth. I think that's an absolute must read. So I think those are three that I would really recommend.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, what would you like to leave our audience with? I guess one huge question that is going through my mind is, I'm aware that there's a lot that businesses can do, and cities can do, and governments can do to help create the circular economy, this regenerative systems that you're trying to apply and create here. But at the same time, what can we do as individuals?
It's a really important point, and because I think people can become paralyzed with overwhelm. It's certainly very difficult as someone who's been a practitioner in sustainability, when you literally have to acknowledge the existential threat to humanity pretty much every day. And I know I hear a lot, Juhi, don't overwhelm people, don't, but here's a reality. The reality is that the environmental kind of breakdown that we're seeing, that we thought would happen in 2 generations time, we're seeing that now. And when I read to my little kids, I've got an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I read to my 4-year-old about, the animals in the jungle and in Africa and so on. And then I have to just acknowledge the fact that by the time she's older, they may not, I don't know, they may be severely depleted in number, if not extinct. You know, it's a tragedy, and it breaks my heart. And so I think it's really important, going back to the point I was making earlier about personal resilience, I think it's really important that we look after ourselves, and we need to make sure that our physical and mental well-being in this time of incredible challenge with COVID and so on is, you know, that we're taking care of ourselves as best we can in whatever way we can, knowing that some people just, you know, don't have the luxury of that others do. But apart from that, it's just do something. You know, I think a lot of us are getting to this point where we're getting to a point where you're like, someone's got to do something, looking around left and to the right and like going, oh, there's no one there. Like maybe I have to do something.
Right.
And then actually we're finding that so many of us are doing that. We're connecting around the world. And that is so wonderful and inspiring. So it really gives me hope that, you know, we've got the internet now. We didn't have that, you know, 20 odd years ago. And now we are able to connect and share best practice. And there's an organization I just want to call out called Circular Economy Victoria. And they're doing some wonderful stuff around just asking people, you know, who want to do something. They go to the CEV, Circular Economy Victoria, and say, you know, I want to do something. I don't, you know, and they say, well, what's your passion? Now, what are your values? What's your passion? And then show them a way to link circular economy and regenerative thinking to what they want to do, be it gardening, be it you want to build a boat, be it, you know, you maybe you want to do something a bit bigger and, you know, for your community. Maybe it's around fashion, maybe whatever it is. You can find out what is happening, and there is a lot happening at a local scale. So I just want to say to people, please don't be disheartened. And I know I've talked about some, you know, kind of like massive issues. There's a saying in New Zealand, let's not boil the ocean, which means kind of let's not try and do everything at once, but just take the thing that you are most passionate about and make a start, and then connect with others who are doing the same. And that's how I think that we're going to overcome these amazing challenges.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your knowledge with us, Juhi. It was an absolute pleasure to have you with us. And I'm sure that people watching this podcast might be inspired to reach out. Perhaps they're working on the same issue somewhere else in Europe or around the world. Please do reach out to Juhi. I will post all the details and everything you need to reach her and the Moonshot project as well below this video. And thank you so much again, Juhi, for taking the time.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Andreja. It's been great.
If you like this video, give it a like and share it with your friends. And if you want to be notified every time we post new content, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell next to it. It's totally free. Make sure you also watch our previous videos on YouTube or subscribe to our High Achievers Quest podcast. Thanks for tuning in.